Okay, let's finish up with chapter 10, motivation and emotion. We were talking about sugar daddy, yours truly. And what it came down to, of course, once I was diagnosed with diabetes type 2 and confirming that really both sides of my family had a prevalence of diabetes. And of course, diabetes is not only linked to diet, exercise, but genetics, culture, the kind of foods that we grow up with are things that are not conducive to maintaining healthy sugar levels. It comes down to a matter of glucose. And so, when it came to my own metabolism, I was already born with a predisposition for diabetes. And I remember as a kid, and I don't know if you were like this or not, but as kids, you would run and play, and your mama used to have to yell at you to get your butt inside so you could have dinner because you were having so much fun. You forgot about eating, right? And I would ride my bike. I had a Schwinn purple Stingray with a sparkling silver banana seat, chrome fenders, and I rode that bike so much I had to replace the wheels several times. And when I got older, I got a 10-speed Schwinn, but they didn't have purple, so I had to settle for blue. And then I got my first car, my 1976 Ford Pinto, the kind that, if you recall, would blow up if somebody rear-ended you. And what do you think happened to my bicycle? Well, it stayed in the garage covered with spider webs, not mine, somebody else's. And I didn't use it much. And so riding my bike or walking to the corner store was not even an issue anymore. I had to drive everywhere, right? And I've seen people drive around when they go to work out at a gym, drive around the parking lot, spending 5, 7 minutes trying to find a spot close to the gym door so they don't have to walk too much to get to the gym door. How does that make any sense? So when it comes to eating, we're conditioned to eat. I notice this even with my dog. Around the time when it's feeding time, the dog starts getting kind of antsy and looks for behavioral cues. I told my wife today, I said, the dog doesn't have a watch, but it has a sense of sensation, right? Like its own spidey sense. It sort of figures, well, I'm listening to my biological stuff going on. I'm getting hungry. And it feels like it's about that time. Of course, if it's around noontime, there's cooking going on, and all that smell enhances all of that, right? So the dog really doesn't need a watch. But some of us aren't really thinking about food until somebody says, "Hey, it's noontime." It's like, "Oh, I'm hungry," right? Let your body do the talking, so to speak. We grow up eating what we eat. And as a kid, I just assumed that everybody else ate flour tortillas, homemade flour tortillas. That's what I grew up with, and that's what I figured everybody ate until I took my homemade flour tortillas to school. And I went to a Catholic school from first to eighth grade. The name of the school in Detroit was called Epiphany, which I didn't know what it meant until years later when I had a name. I had an epiphany on the name Epiphany. And the kids surrounded me. It's like, what is that? They had never seen a flour tortilla before. This is before we had Taco Bell and all the stores weren't selling rubber tortillas back then. And the kids were just astounded. And then I realized, oh my goodness, these kids, they don't grow up like I did. They just usually have their Wonder Bread and and so forth. Has anybody here eaten an insect before? In some cultures, this is the norm, where you just eat insects. I just watched this film series about street foods in Asia, and this one guy specializes in making eel soup, right? Now, some people are like, oh, that's so gross. Or this other woman specializes in making snails. Oh, that's so gross. But if you grow up with that, and obviously they had plenty of customers, that's the norm. And don't you even pretend like you haven't eaten an insect, because the statistics show as you sleep over the years, you consume so many spiders. I should know, right? While you're sleeping. Being obese has a stigma. And it's interesting because right away when we see somebody who's heavy, some people will make the assumption, well, they just eat too much, they're lazy, they're not very bright, they're not motivated. And of course, we don't know anything about that person. We're just judging them, right? We don't know anything about their biology, their diet, their attempts to exercise, their genetics. Now, culturally, things have changed drastically over the years, right? Years ago, if you saw a large person in a painting, that was reflective of somebody who was wealthy and healthy, right? Because they had plenty of food. If you saw somebody super thin, that person was emaciated, diseased, poor, right? Because they didn't have enough food to maintain any kind of weight. Culturally speaking, it varies from culture to culture, but large is still in, right? And this is the message we're getting from a lot of Western cultures that is you must look like that if you want to be in. It's amazing because every time I get an advertisement from South Coast Plaza, this beautiful publication they send once in a while to my home, I always see models that look just like this. And I just think, those poor things, those poor things. And usually they're not smiling. They usually look very unhappy because if I had a Tic Tac for breakfast, I would be very unhappy, right? And of course, talking about these disorders makes me nervosa, but I'm going to talk about them anyways. Things like anorexia nervosa, where a person's distortion of how they look is pretty intact. And so they'll go out of the way not to consume anything, right? If you force an anorexic person to have breakfast, they'll do everything they can to exercise or burn off or give the illusion that they're actually eating it when they're not. A little bit different from that is bulimia nervosa, and some people think that anorexia and bulimia are on the same spectrum, the same continuum, because they're all about control. With bulimia, you have an individual who consumes massive quantities and then goes out of the way to expel them from their bodies, either by taking laxatives or inducing vomiting, right? So, why are eating disorders like obesity and anorexia and bulimia nervosas mixed in with motivation and emotion? Because everything's tied together, right? Emotion. Emotion's such an interesting topic to me because the definition, involves physical responses, changing thoughts, etc. Definition is pretty straightforward, but to actually describe emotion, that's a different story. For example, have you ever had so much emotion going through you, you couldn't even explain how you felt? Or is it possible to love and hate the same person at the same time? That doesn't make any sense because we think of them as the both ends of the spectrum, love and hate. But if you've seen a soap opera, right, telenovela, somebody strangling somebody while they're saying, I love you know what I'm talking about. So emotion is really tied into the physiological response, right? The expression of the person and the cognitive appraisal, right? And we most of the time just see the expressive behavior. It's really hard sometimes to see the physiological response, and certainly difficult to know what's the thinking behind emotion. So I think that's what makes emotion complicated. Now, I want to talk about my next case study. And the next case study's name uh, is called Johnny the Refractory Man. Johnny the Refractory Man. And before I talk about Johnny, I want to talk about Masters and Johnson. Masters and Johnson spent some time studying sexual behavior of Americans, right? And they did it in a scientific manner. And some of their techniques were pretty controversial, but they outlined what's known as the sexual response cycle. It's what occurs during a sexual experience between two adults. During that time, they noticed there was a period called the refractory period. And that's a time that typically men must wait before they're able to re engage in the sexual response cycle, right? That time can vary from a few minutes to hours, years, months, so forth. It really depends on the situation, right? So that leads me to the case study of Johnny, the refractory man. Let me share you a little bit of information. Here's Johnny, refractory man. It takes place at an agency that I worked at in Lansing, Michigan, known as Cristo Rey Counseling Services, right? Cristo Rey Counseling Services. Now, for our multilingual friends, we know that Cristo Rey stands for Christ the King. This place was not a religious institution, but however, the head of the agency at the time was very religious, so he decided to call it Christ the King. So I got a chance to work with Johnny. He was a Mexican American male, about 40 years old, and he was referred to me by the courts because he was caught breaking and entering into a church. He was intoxicated at the time and doesn't really remember the incident. So when he came to therapy, we started working on his alcohol abuse, and he asked me an interesting question during our treatment. He said, you know, what's a normal sexual activity? And I asked him when was the last time he had any kind of sexual activity. He said 10 years. That's why he's called Johnny the Refractory Man. And it turns out that a lot of it was tied to rejection early in his relationships, and he just lost the ability to engage. He also asked me another interesting question. He asked me if I could tell him the definition of love, right? And that's why I wrote love on this board here, because he said, as far as he knew, he's never been loved and no one has ever loved him. And that posed an interesting question because, you know, to me, emotions are like a box of crayons. Right? They start off very basic and then they get more and more complex with complex names. And for me to pull out a dictionary and say, well, here's a definition of love, or say, well, listen to this music or watch this clip of a movie, I don't think that was enough for him. How do you explain what love is to someone who feels that they've never experienced it? Pretty powerful situation. Very difficult to do, no doubt. Okay, now time for review. First question I want you to talk about is the story of Sugar Daddy. Be able to talk about the entire story, including the diagnosis and the symptoms. Second question I want you to be able to talk about is the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and please feel free to add your own examples. I know some of you like to use what the book has, but think about some of your own experiences. And the last question I want you to be able to talk about is Johnny the Refractory Man. Tell me all that information as I have listed here. That was a very complicated case, of course, and to walk around thinking that starting with your mother, you've never ever been loved is quite a traumatic way to start your world experience. Hard to get motivated. And of course, I think that tied into his substance abuse, trying to mask all this massive emotions that he had of feeling unloved in this world, right? Okay, that wraps up chapter 10. Have a wonderful